Today's episode is brought to you by Chords, makers of award-winning professional-grade connectivity solutions designed by integrators for integrators. If you're listening to this podcast, you already know that reliability is crucial. That's why professionals around the world choose Chords. Born in Australia and trusted in over 50 countries, Chords provides robust, fast and effective HDMI, audio, networking, USB-C and control cabling engineered for residential, commercial and mission-critical applications. With over 20 years of experience and a promise of connectivity assured, every Chords product is tested, certified and backed by expert support. Level up your installs today by visiting chords.com.au. That's KORDZ.com.au. Hello and welcome to Master Integrator. I'm your host, Paul Skelton. Have you ever caught yourself apologising to an appliance? I did that recently to my robot vacuum. I know, I'm a bit of a wanker. It bumped into my office chair leg and I instinctively blurted out, sorry. Of course, it didn't talk back. If it did, there would be far bigger issues in play other than a momentary memory lapse, but it got me thinking. If we're already interacting with technology as if it's human, what happens when that technology starts behaving like one? What happens when it learns, makes decisions, or starts making us uncomfortable? As a society, we're not just talking about smart homes anymore. We're inching closer to a future where humanoid robots live among us. They'll cook, clean, monitor our security systems, maybe even break up a fight, or, God forbid, put the cat in the dryer. Now, the technology's not there just yet, but it is coming. And when it does, who decides what's right or wrong or safe? That's the question we're unpacking today with Dr. Stephen Hart, an ex-Telstra engineer who now works at the intersection of leadership, human behaviour and roboethics. He describes himself as an ethicist in training, which is honestly one of the most refreshing things I've heard in this space. His view? Anyone who thinks they have all the ethical answers in AI is probably missing the point. Together, we'll explore the blurry lines between automation, AI, robotics and morality. What are integrators responsible for today? How do we prepare for what's next? Should you be asking your supplier questions about surveillance and decision-making now, even if the system just turns on lights or plays Spotify? There are no easy answers here, but that's what makes this conversation so important. And frankly, so damn fascinating. Before we kick off, a huge thank you to our sponsors, Chords Australia, delivering predictable reliability in AV connectivity, and Connected Magazine, Australia's premier publication for smart home and commercial AV professionals. Their support helps keep this show running, and it helps you to stay sharp in a rapidly evolving industry. So grab your favourite brew, settle in, and let's talk about ethics, humanoids, and what it means to be a good person in a world where your robot might just have opinions of its own. This is Master Integrator. Here's Dr. Stephen Hart. So let's start by going into a bit of your background. So where are you from, basically? and tell us a little bit about your career today.
Yeah, I guess a little bit about my journey. I started my career in what was telecom in those days, which is now Telstra, in electrical engineering or telecommunications engineering, really. And that's where my undergraduate is as an associate diploma. So a technologist, not an engineer, working directly on the equipment. And in those days, they were electromechanical machines. Some of the folks who are listening may not realise that phones used to have a dial and would literally send electrical impulses into the machine, which was the telephone exchange, and that would create further electromechanical action with the technology and connect you to the people that you want to connect to. From there, I moved into organisational development, change, a doctorate in building leadership capability. And my interests around things like robotics and the integration of robotics into workplaces really is stemmed from, I guess, that dormant interest in things mechanical, things human related. And then when you come to think about humanoids, it's the combination of the both. It's these robots or these humanoids in whatever form they take being programmed by humans, but essentially operating mechanically in the world.
And on LinkedIn, you describe yourself as an ethicist in training. So what do you mean by that? What does that actually entail?
Yeah, look, I think when I first started my interest in this space and I started to look at, the human dynamic of the introduction of AI, one of the things that was clear, well, two things was clear. I was never going to be a leader in the coding space. That's not where my strengths are. So I'm not going to be designing AI. I'm not going to be writing code for AI. But my area of interest really is in the ethical application of AI and the applications around robotics into workplaces and into society. But the reason I call myself an ethicist in training is because I think you have to be a bit of a wanker to refer to yourself as an ethicist. I mean, that's for others, I guess, to determine whether your thoughts on particular issues actually have some substance. And so I think, and anyone really who's in the space of AI who is claiming to be an ethicist, I think there's some caution around that because I think debate's still out on what the ethics of AI actually look like moving forward. Throughout history, our ethics have evolved and we're about to enter quite a significant disruption in society through AI. And undoubtedly, our ethics will evolve through that time. And so coming from a position of I am an ethicist and an expert in ethics, well, maybe today, but maybe not tomorrow. So I think if you're playing in the space of ethics or writing around the space of ethics, being open-minded enough to say, well, this is a space of continuous learning for us as we move forward and we need to be mindful of that. So that's a very long answer to a very short question of why it says ethicist in training.
So when it does come to ethics and AI in general, obviously a lot of people are really excited about the technology or they're incredibly fearful of the technology and where it's headed. Do you think ethics has had enough, has there been enough focus on ethics to date, or are we incredibly behind where we should be?
Look, I think there's conversations occurring, but I still think we're way behind where we need to be. The assumption I think most people have is that ethics will be built into the technology, will be built into the platform. It was only people who follow X. Grok went crazy a few weeks ago when it was let loose and it had to be reined in. So the idea that ethics is built into the technology, is built into the machine or built into the AI, I think that's concerning that we're putting so much trust in what is essentially large language models that are sometimes having delusions. So I think we are behind. I don't think there's any really strong regulation that's agreed on. But as I said before, I don't think there's sufficient thought gone into what might our ethical position be in the future. We're trying to force fit our current understanding of ethics into some kind of future model. There's also a difference in even our current underpinning philosophies around ethics. So in the West, often our philosophies around ethics are centered around individualism and autonomy. Whereas in the East, they balance that with the concept of the greater good. So even today, you wouldn't say that there's a universal acceptance of what ethics are and what is ethical. And we do have AI being developed both in the East and in the West. And so, as we move forward, there's no clear agreement about even what ethics looks like currently, let alone what might look like in the future. So I think it's a field of opportunity, Paul, I think is probably the point I'm trying to make.
So that in itself is somewhat concerning, that there is so much subjectivity around the idea of ethics. And you're right, and because there's obviously multiple countries and multiple backgrounds involved with creating the technology. How do we navigate that? Or aren't we at risk of just going around in circles and not getting anywhere?
Well, I think society has self-corrected over time, but, part of it is looking back into history and looking at how ethics has evolved through history and continues to evolve. So, if I'm in medieval times, my understanding of what is ethical practice is very different to a modern society. Ethical practice would have been about, defending my city. They literally built walls around medieval cities and so it was very ethical, to put walls around your society and exclude others. That was considered quite ethical in the day. Then with the emergence of, Christianity, there were certain ethics that were accompanying that, and, some, I won't go too much into that detail, but there were maybe some unpleasant things that happened to societies in the name of spreading that philosophy. When, Europeans first came to Australia, our understanding of ethics was very different to the inhabitants' understanding of ethics. And so that created disharmony between those societies. And I'm not here to say either any of those things were right or wrong. And I think that's one of the interesting aspects of ethics, is that sometimes if we try to position ourselves and say, well, this understanding of ethics is right and this understanding of ethics or interpretation of ethics is wrong, I think we tie ourselves up in knots. So is it concerning? Of course it's concerning. Will society self-correct in some ways? Maybe. The current, I guess, work that's done in this space, as you guys know, is there's a bit of greed in there, Paul, and people are trying to be first to market with a whole range of technology, and a whole range of large language models. And, they're doing it for money. They're not doing it for the greater good of humanity. And so that's always going to be concerning from an ethical standpoint.
So I think that also kind of feeds into what I found when I do talk to people about ethics within the smart home industry. I kind of get a mixed response with other people who say it's really important, but at the same time, it's too difficult, or it's the subjectivity that comes in and they think someone else is going to sort it out. So I know that you obviously founded Roboethics Australia with the idea to kind of promote ethical, inclusive robotics. But what I'm wondering is there a way to put this into almost layman's terms about why this is important to the everyday user?
Yeah. Okay. So, really good question. And so I was on a webinar with Jonathan Hurst, who's one of the co-founders of Agility, one of the robotics firms, and he has the robot Digit, And he was talking about the introduction of humanoid robots into the home and what needs to happen. Now, at the moment, we can't guarantee the robot's not going to fall on the baby, okay? These are 6 foot tall, 80 kilo machines, They're not advanced enough yet that we can guarantee they're not going to fall on the baby or, cause some harm incidentally. They're not even advanced enough yet not to put the cat in the dryer. So the reason that ethics are important is because we need to ensure that as this technology moves forward, at the very least, it does no harm. So that's at the very least, And then you start to think about humanoids and robotics more generally in the home. And, I've dabbled in the space of setting up my home with all kind of security measures and all those kind of things, And at the moment, a sensor might detect movement and trigger something, So there's a cause effect, an alarm goes off or a notification to your phone or something like that. Okay, now think about a humanoid in the home and it's on safeguarding mode at night. Now, at what point can the humanoid actually intervene to protect the human? It will have the capability. This thing is, as I said, 6 foot tall, 80 kilos. So, someone who you don't want comes into the home. So there's the level 1 stuff around, there's an environmental response, The figure that just popped in my mind is Robot from Lost in Space, Will Robinson, danger, that kind of environmental response. At what point, though, because it will be capable, can the robot actually intervene and protect the householder? And so that's an ethical question. Physically, will it be able to prevent threats to the householder? Will it actually be able to intervene? Will it be able to restrain? Will it take a knife off someone? Physically, can it be programmed to do that? Yes, it can. But should it? And so that's when we start to think about, can robots and humanoids in particular, can and should they be programmed to essentially restrain or even harm humans to protect other humans? So they're the types of, I think, real ethical dilemmas that we need to be thinking about, because it's going to be more than just folding your laundry. as much as I really want one in my house to fold my laundry and to wash the dishes, they will be capable of so much more.
So you've mentioned humanoids there a fair bit, but at the moment, that's still in the distance, really. I mean, it's happening, but there's already a lot of automation systems out there, and they already have different capabilities when it comes to security, when it comes to even household chores, essentially. Look at robo vacuums.
Yeah, yeah.
So when you are talking about ethics, are you only really talking about humanoids, or are we already looking at it today for those, I guess, more entry-level systems? And where do you draw the line between robotics, AI, automation, or is there a line?
No, really good question. The interest primarily is around advanced humanoids and how they will impact into society. But the principles apply to our other robotics that are being introduced into domestic and other applications. So, depending on how we frame and how, I guess, what we encompass in that term, you look at the introduction of advanced systems into aircraft, and then if you think about that, well, advanced systems in the home as well, so controlling your air conditioning, controlling your lighting, sweeping the floor, all those types of things. But in the end, society at the moment is created for human type beings, things that have legs and arms and that type of movement. So the ethical considerations that I'm mainly interested in around the humanoids, but an example of, I guess, how it translates into the current environment is, and the current technology is around the monitoring components. And so again, there's been lots of examples where companies, God bless them, who have got back-end surveillance going on. So, hey, I think this camera is secure in my home, but in fact, it's listening, observing, and recording what's going on. So we barely have sufficient understanding of that sort of ethical dilemma, let alone if we have a human type device in our homes.
So when you do look at what is already out there today, whether it's from a surveillance perspective, access control, air conditioning even, are there ethical issues that are arising today from these systems that you think need to be solved before we go down the humanoid path? Or are we too late in that process? The humanoids are coming, the robots are coming.
Yeah, look, again, good question, Paul. I think it comes back to, as I said, the emerging view of what is ethics and what might it look like in the future. At a very fundamental level, are we creating a two-tier society where people have automation in their homes that is helping them to save money on their electricity, that is, helping them to surveil not only their home but their immediate environment, whereas other folks don't have that. They can't control their air conditioning, remotely, or, they can't arrive home to a nice cool house or a nice warm house, depending on where you live. But there's other technologies, which is impacting on us in terms of smart meters, for example, so where government is controlling essentially access to the rates in which we even pay for electricity through smart meters in our homes. So have we really grappled sufficiently with some of those ethical considerations? Maybe not, but I don't think it's as society shifting as what's coming. And probably that's going to be the motivator for a more, hopefully, serious look in this topic, because at the moment there's this individual choice. If I want a surveillance camera in my home, that's my individual choice and I do that. If I want to, control my air conditioning remote, well, that's an individual choice. When we start to look at humanoids navigating and through society, doing all kinds of different tasks, that's when all of a sudden we've got this much broader impact into society than individuals in their home.
Connected Magazine is your go-to publication for the commercial and residential AV and smart home industry. Let's Talk Insurance is one of the biggest headaches for integrators, and with a lack of industry recognition, the challenges just keep growing. In this edition, Connected digs into which policies integrators are using, whether they actually work, and what needs to change. Grab the latest edition of Connected magazine or visit the website for more news, analysis, and product coverage. Links in this episode's description. So, what about the idea of moral agency? Because I know that was coming up a lot when I was researching before this podcast, but this idea of a robot or a humanoid being a moral agent. So, are you able to explain what that means and also where you stand on that, whether you think that they will have moral agency or whether that's something that is a risk?
Yeah, I think, look, I might muck up my authors here. But Asimov wrote I, Robot. Was that the three sort of conditions of robots, do no harm to humans? That's all rubbish. I mean, there's no such thing. In terms of whether they have moral agency will depend on the programming. And so if we're saying that, well, we should program humanoids so that they have some kind of moral agency, well, whose morals for a start? And that's what I meant when I was talking about the evolving nature of ethics. And if you're talking about evolving nature of ethics, you're also talking about the evolving nature of morality. So this sense that, well, they'll have some kind of moral agency and, they'll be operating for the greater good and all those kind of, well, if they're programmed, they will be. If they're not programmed that way. I actually wrote an article about, a criminal gang of humanoids that, someone hacked. Now, you can't say they're not going to be hacked. They're going to be hacked, all right? So you could hack a robot and turn it into a criminal and, it'll do all the thievery for you. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question sufficiently, but the concept of moral agency, when we start to talk about these issues, is really a concept of how good the programming is. And the other thing that comes with, the whole idea of agency, of course, is some sense of choice. And, I'm empowered, I have choice, all those kind of things. Well, the choices that the humanoid makes will be dependent on the programming and the quality of the programming. Yeah, I'm not sure if I fully answered that, Paul, but I gave it a good crack.
That's all I can ask for. So I guess a few of the other issues that have come up while I have been kind of getting my head into this whole side of roboethics, and it is such a broad topic, and I know that it's not possible to have such a definitive answer in a short period of time. But I guess one of the other things that I did notice that you wrote about was algorithmic bias. So can you explain what that is and how that might apply to smart home systems that are both available today, but also how that will change with the introduction of humanoid robotics?
Well, I guess the simplest way to think about that is the algorithm is saying this is the best course of action, and so it's biased to be thinking that way and it's biased to act that way. Probably a good example in the home environment is that, government says that the ideal temperature for your air conditioning is 24 degrees in summer. And so it's possible that there could be regulation come in that says, well, the algorithm is biased to support the government's view of what is the ideal temperature, and you as the human can no longer influence that. And so when you turn on your air conditioner and it's very hot and it's steamy, if you live in Cairns or something even today, the air conditioning is algorithmically designed within certain parameters that you can't override. And so that's where these biases come into play, because that's the opinion of someone. All right, the opinion of someone is that that's the best temperature. So you start to have these predetermined, I guess, factors come into play through the programming of what is correct and what is not correct.
Okay, so I guess the majority of people who will be listening to this, smart home integrators, they won't have a background in philosophy or necessarily even AI. What should they be doing today in order to start preparing for these questions that, well, they already exist now, but I mean, because it can be an incredibly daunting subject, what could they do realistically now to prepare themselves to answer those questions to their clients, or to be in a position where they know that they need to learn more and this is where they can go, sort of thing?
Yeah. And look, I think they're doing that today with maybe not even being aware of that. One of the fundamental things, in terms of where we currently sit in terms of our morality and ethics is kind of do no harm. So if a client is saying, hey, when you detect an intruder, 240 volts through the handle of the door, I mean, that's, they're not going to do that. Hopefully, they could. It's possible. It's just a relay switch. It's just if this happens, then do this. So, you can do that even today, but we don't because we have this ethical parameter backed up by laws, I should say, but we have this ethical parameter which says, well, you don't do that. And so that might sound like an extreme case, but there would be other factors such as people requesting cameras to be put up to spy on their neighbours. There'd be, and so people are dealing with those ethical dilemmas even today. There'd be other factors come into play around, a lot of it at the moment is around surveillance. Oh, look, I want to be able to surveil what's happening, but I want to do that stealthily so no one knows, even in my own household. So I think maybe what I'm really trying to say here, Paul, is that I think most reasonable people, and most people are reasonable, do have a moral and ethical compass. My real concern is that how do we ensure that AI has a moral and ethical compass? Because maybe if it's left to its own devices, it may go down a bad path. And we need to sort of get in front of that and put the blockages up and the guardrails up so that it kind of doesn't have that choice. If it gets to the stage of having free choice, it's not there yet, by the way. So, we haven't reached artificial general intelligence yet where it's making its own decisions. But if it does get to that point, we want to make sure it's making what we as humans would consider to be good, ethical, moral decisions. And that time may not be far away. They're all racing. Everyone's racing for AGI, and that will come into the home environment. That will come into your, every day around my house. There will be stuff with AGI in it. All right. And we want it to make the right choices when it is able to make decisions, and it has that capability, and it will have that capability.
So with the AI systems that exist today, are there questions that integrators should be asking now of the suppliers, of the manufacturers, so they can best cover themselves?
Well, and that's a really good question, best cover yourself. There's some really interesting, I guess, scenarios playing out where who is responsible if something goes wrong? Is it the installer for not sufficiently providing, advice to the consumer about, what is actually being installed? Is it the manufacturer who is coding any kind of even narrow intelligence AI? Is it the owner? And what obligations do we have to the owner, particularly if we're on selling, which a lot of folks would be doing? They would be purchasing and then on selling to the customer. So it will be interesting to see where some of that liability falls. But I think it is a good practice for people to start to get into, to delve more into some of the back end and background to the suppliers that are supplying the devices that we're installing, because I think we do have some obligation. If someone's calling us and saying, hey, I want you to install this, I want you to, put in these smart home devices, I think we do have an obligation to understand what we're doing and some of the back end of what we're doing and some of the consequences of what we're doing, and to inform the customer. So do I think people need to raise their awareness of some of these issues and what be occurring in the back? I think they do. I really do.
So as autonomous systems, AI systems, AGI systems, they become more mainstream as they enter homes, as they enter offices. Ultimately, who needs to be the person or people who decide on what that ethical framework is? Is it governments because they're not necessarily technically minded? Is it the tech companies because they have a vested interest, commercially speaking? So it's probably not necessarily going to be them. But who, in your mind, will be the one to set those guardrails?
Yeah, again, a really good question. I think there's some principles about, I'm probably responsible for what happens in my own home and what I allow to happen. So if someone enters my home and has an injury as a result of some kind of device that I have in my home, even now, trips over the RoboVac. All right. So where are we at the moment? And so there'd be this whole liability thing come into play. Do you have home insurance? Does it cover tripping over the RoboVac? Was I walking towards the RoboVac and tripped over it, or did it actually intersect my path? And actually it was the RoboVac's fault that I tripped over. So I think those questions are with us even now. And, I think it is interesting how that will eventually play out. I don't think it's a big deal at the moment because there probably hasn't been many examples, or the examples that we have had haven't gone to litigation. They've probably been resolved in some kind of mediation or something like that. But it is an interesting, who is responsible, I think is a great question. In the workplace, for example, again, I've looked at, can I be bullied by AI, And you probably can be. If there's an AI agent that's assigning you work and is overloading you with your workload, is that bullying? It probably is. Who's responsible for that? Well, is it the coder who's actually coded the work rate at which they expect humans to perform? Or is it the organization for not providing a safe workplace? And it's probably going to fall back on the organization. So I think some of those questions are starting to emerge. There's still, we still really want to get some good case law around some of these things, even autonomous vehicles, when they've caused death and injury and all those types of things. I mean, who's liable? I don't even think that's been fully resolved yet. Is it the manufacturer? Is it the operator? Is it the whatever? So I think liability is a really interesting question. But again, it comes back to, we're talking about humans here. It'd be good if we err on the side of safety. Again, I come back, we don't want the machine, whether it be a humanoid or a giant RoboVac or some kind of, autonomous washing machine that's wanders around the house picking up clothes and washes them itself or something. You don't want those things falling on the baby. You don't want them falling on the dog, and you certainly don't want the machine picking up the cat and throwing it in with the rest of the washing, So I think there's responsibility on a number of parties here. But at the end of the day, it's possibly, I'm not a legal person, but it's possibly going to be the homeowner because they've allowed that to occur in their home. But from an ethics point of view, if we come back to the ethical component, who would be ethically and morally responsible for putting someone else in danger? Probably the person who invited that person into their home, So I think all of us, when we invite people into our home, have this moral, ethical obligation not to do them harm, not to have some kind of rampaging RoboVac running around the place.
So in your mind, is regulation kind of the only option here? Or as you mentioned right at the start of this podcast about, society righting itself, will this be a societal change or societal mandate, I guess?
Yeah, again, a good question. I think if you look at it from a safety point of view, was regulation needed to actually create a safe workplace? It probably was. If we left it to industry, we'd still have lots of people dying in workplaces because of the cost analysis. It's without getting too ruthless. It's like someone gets killed on a work site, the fine is about $100,000. And there would be people around who would say, "Oh, that's a reasonable price to pay because I got $1 million worth of productivity by having this workplace practice in place." So it's in those circumstances, I think, where it's been proven that regulation is a good thing, when it comes to physical safety. So I think there's definitely benefit for that. I think the bigger question is, do I think regulation around ethics is something that's needed? Look, hey, Paul, I'm an ethicist in training. So that's still a question I think that's open because I think if we start to try and regulate morals at this early stage of AI and robotic development. I think that's just challenging, I think. And there will be different societies who have different views. As I said, like in the East, the idea of, well, we'll have whatever their form of regulation is around the introduction of AI so that it's for the greater good. It's about, what's best for society in their concept of society. Whereas in the West, we're more likely to say, well, individualism and capitalism and, people kind of do what they want. So I think that's also going to be a dilemma as we move forward.
So probably very unrelated to regulations and all that. There's a bit of a curveball question then. But the rate that we're progressing towards robotics, towards humanoids, with what you're seeing come through, do you think that there is a place in the industry for the current systems that are out there from a smart home perspective? Or do you think this is going to be completely revolutionary and change how businesses in this industry need to operate and what they'll be supplying and what they'll be doing in the future?
Yeah. No, again, a really good question. Look, at the moment, they're projecting, an advanced humanoid when they come full production, probably going to be about 30 grand US. Not everyone's going to have one, and so that's an ethical dilemma in itself in terms of equity, And then look, if you've got one and it's off doing the shopping for you, it's not at home safeguarding the home, is it? So then you start, oh, well, do I have a home humanoid, and do I have a, take the kids to school humanoid, and do I have and again, not many people are going to be able to, some will, by the way, but not many people are going to. So is there still a place for discrete devices that do specific function? Of course there is, and there always will be, I think. The concept of the humanoid as it can do everything is not practical. But what it will do, I think, will integrate much better all of our devices. So I think, if we're looking at, the industry and what the industry is doing, having your radar on, looking for devices that will have good integration into the future, into AI and particularly into robotics, may be useful because, you may want the humanoid connected into the broader home surveillance and home maintenance environment so that it can be monitoring those things, because these things will be 24 hours, 7 days a week. Like there's no rest. They're not waiting for, an alert has come up on my phone and now is a good time to push on that and, open that up. No, it's all instantaneous. So I think having systems that integrate with these robotics in the future will be useful. But Paul, you're quite right. We're still a way away from that. Okay. So it's coming, it's on the horizon. But if I'm installing integrated smart devices into homes right today, I'm not worried about what's going to happen in the next 5 years even. Like when they first come in, they'll be in very controlled environments. There already are some in controlled environments in warehouses and factories and, so that's already happening. When will that translate into the home? Look, you're going to have your local cameras and your local alarms and your devices that can detect when a window is being opened, and all that's happening and is going to continue to happening for many years to come.
So it really is a case of be alert but not alarmed.
Exactly. Yeah.
So to kind of wrap everything up with a nice little bow, what's the one thing that integrators should take away from this conversation today? If it's first steps, next steps, if it's something they should just have in the back of their mind or something they should already be doing, what would you want them to really take away from this?
Oh, just that awareness. Things are coming, things are going to be happening. When it does come, it'll happen pretty quick. Once someone gets, a highly functional, AGI humanoid out into the marketplace, which they're all racing to do. They're all racing to do that. That will be a game changer. Musk talks about billions of these things running around everywhere. And I can't disagree. I just can't disagree with that, But will they actually be complementary to autonomous standalone devices and or integrate with those devices? Well, I think they will. Like it's, it's a whole suite of devices. And so being aware of the future, I think, is where we're at. And, you asked me for a summary, but I can't summarize it any better than you did when you said be alert but not alarmed, I think that is the bow. I mean, I think that's the bow from today.
That is it for this episode. A big thanks to Dr. Stephen Hart for joining me and unpacking some of the most complex and confronting questions facing our industry. As integrators, we're not just wiring up control systems anymore. We're shaping how people interact with their homes, their data, and increasingly their decisions. You don't need a philosophy degree to care about this stuff, but you do need awareness, because the systems we install today will be the foundation for whatever comes next, whether it's predictive automation, humanoid robotics, or something we haven't even imagined yet. If this conversation sparked something, or challenged how you think about your role in this space, I'd love to hear from you. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn or by email at info@masterintegrator.com.au. Whether it's a great suggestion, a story worth sharing, or just a reaction, I'm always keen to keep the dialogue going. And yes, merch is finally on its way. It's a small but meaningful way to support the show and show your support for the industry. Thanks again to Chords and Connected Magazine for supporting the podcast and backing these conversations. Until next time, install with intention, stay curious, and don't let technology get too far ahead of the questions. Thanks for listening to Master Integrator. I'm Paul Skelton. I'll see you next time.